I'm with David Pileggi at Christ Church in Jerusalem, and we're talking about the special project, the Jewish Believers Holocaust Project. David, tell us a bit more about this big project.
Well, thank you for asking, and it is a big project. It's actually a huge project because for the first time, my colleague, Kevin Crombie, is doing systematic research, different countries in Europe, looking at the life of Jewish Christians or Jewish believers in Jesus before the war and how they suffered under the hands of the Nazis, not for being Christians or Jewish Christians, but for being Jews. Other people have started this work, and we don't want to steal their glory or to take all the credit, but I think this is the first large, systematic, long-term research project looking at the life of Jewish believers in Europe before and during the war.
Do we know how many Messianic Jewish believers died?
Well, that is always the question. Everyone wants to ask that question. People in the past have talked about hundreds of thousands, and somebody even once proposed the idea there may have been up to 1 million, but those are exaggerated numbers. I think Kelvin Crombie, who is, again, in the midst of his research, he will eventually propose a number in the tens of thousands. But again, I don't want to steal his thunder, and we'll wait for his preliminary results based on the research that he's already done in Holland, Belgium, Poland, and maybe other countries now as well.
And of course, Messianic believers suffered just because they were Jewish, but also Christian as well, didn't they?
Well, they largely suffered or primarily suffered because they were Jews. And I think this is an important point to make because in all of this, we're not trying to Christianize the Holocaust or to somehow remove the horror, the sting of Nazi anti-Semitism. Of course, many Christians suffered as well, but the Holocaust, the Jewish Holocaust, or the murder of the Jewish peoples by the Nazis, was something unprecedented in all of human history. And when compared to the, you might say, the suffering of non-Jews, there is some differences or some distinct features that we need to take in mind. I would like to emphasize that the suffering of the Jewish people in some ways doesn't lessen the suffering of non-Jews. Suffering is suffering. And in some ways, we have to be very careful about the way that we compare. And in our comparisons, we need to be careful not to minimize the pain and trauma suffered by one group or another.
Now, many Holocaust survivors have actually now died. So is there an urgency for this, or are you just talking to families and getting their stories?
Oh, my goodness. I was talking to a researcher yesterday or 2 days ago, and it's a man who also is a historian of Jewish Christianity, and we both lamented and almost shed tears over the fact that he didn't start his project and we didn't start ours 20 or 30 years ago when there were many witnesses who were still alive. So research investigation into the Holocaust will continue, and it has been going on since almost the day started the minute the war stopped, if not before. But just looking at this specific aspect of Jewish believers or Jewish Christians, that started way, way too late, and it's very regrettable.
What sort of things are you finding out about the Jewish believers from that time?
Well, we have a dilemma here, right? Who is a Jewish Christian? Why did a Jewish person, quote unquote, convert? Why did a Jewish person become a follower of Jesus? And of course, sometimes it was done for social reasons, or there were times that Jews were born into families of Jewish Christians, or sometimes you have folks who, in many cases, they had, you might say, a genuine encounter with the Jewish Jesus, and they became believers out of choice. So the first issue is, who is a Jewish Christian, right? And who are you going to count in this number? And so since we can't go back and investigate the motives of every Jewish believer or Christian Jew, again, the definitions are kind of murky here. We're simply counting all of them, all right? And some people may say, well, you're just counting those who were nominally Christian, who maybe wanted to escape the stigma of being Jewish. And the answer to that question, yes, we are, because we don't know the intentions of the heart. So therefore, we have to stick with the broadest definition.
What sort of stories are you hearing?
Oh, the stories are amazing. Many of them came out after the war, but at the same time, they were somehow forgotten or swept under the rug. And today, if you ask any Christian or you ask, evangelicals, especially those who might, again, have a certain love for Israel, they may be able to tell you about Corrie ten Boom, but they won't be able to tell you about the Yoch family from Lvov, or they won't be able to tell you about you might say, the different congregations of Jewish believers that existed in the Łódź ghetto, or the congregations of Jewish believers that existed in the Warsaw ghetto, or the different groups of believers that met in the city of Białystok. All of these Jewish Christians were either taken to a pit and shot, or many of them were sent to places like Treblinka or Auschwitz. And so we have stories, and these stories they can be quite moving.
Has the Holocaust, what the families from these Jewish Christians have suffered, does it affect later generations?
It certainly does. I mean, we know that the trauma, Holocaust trauma, or the trauma of such an event or events similar to the Holocaust, is passed down from generation to generation. It's passed down not simply in the way children are nurtured and raised, but it's passed down actually in the DNA. And from the recent studies that have been made, the trauma suffered by Holocaust survivors, for example, actually changes their DNA, and that modified DNA is passed down from generation to generation. So it's something that doesn't go away. And, we oftentimes hear non-Jews complain in a manner such as this: why don't the Jewish people just forget about the Holocaust and move on? I mean, after all, it happened 80 years ago, and they can't keep focusing on the past. They need to move forward. Well, I think there are some really good sociological, biological, and historical reasons why that's simply not possible. So Jewish people have you might say, a history of focusing on the past, because the most often repeated biblical commandment is remember. So God tells the Jewish people, tells people who receive the Hebrew scriptures, right, over and over again, remember, 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 remember. History should become meaningful, and it should become a guide as to the way a nation or even an individual moves into the future.
Of course, as well, Israel remember Purim as well, which was another sense of annihilation for the Jews, and they have that as a celebration, remembering God's deliverance, don't they?
That's right, but they remember Purim. But in actual fact, you might think of Judaism as a religion about memory. And an Orthodox Jew gets up in the morning and puts on a kippah, they touch a mezuzah, wears what we would call prayer tassels, at least in English, prays 3 times a day, celebrates the Sabbath, holidays, etc., etc. All of these help a Jew, either a man or a woman, remember God and what God has done for them, and it helps them to stay focused, right, on the character of God. Yeah. And so these things that are evoking memory throughout the day are essential, simply because as human beings we are so forgetful, whether we're a Jew or a Christian. It is so common for us to receive a miracle from God in the morning and by the afternoon be complaining that he doesn't really care for us or doesn't watch over us or provide for us. And so the Bible understands human nature very well. And God commands his children, including Christians, to remember, to remember, to remember, to remember. And this memory, by the way, is not commanded in order to carry on a feud or to be bitter or to nurse a grudge from generation to generation. The Bible makes that very, very clear. We remember in order to obey and to be faithful to God. So on more than one occasion, the Hebrew Bible tells us, or tells the Jewish people, remember that you were slaves in Egypt. And then the verse doesn't go on to say, well, since you were slaves in Egypt, don't forget what those Egyptians did to you. Carry on a feud, have a grudge, never forgive them, never speak well of them. No, it says, remember you were slaves in Egypt, and so don't treat the stranger or the alien in your midst, harshly. Remember what happened to you so that you don't do the same thing.
Calvin is the one that's doing all this investigation. I imagine it's very difficult and very emotional doing this.
Yes, this is a very, very difficult process because when you study the Holocaust, the tendency is to just think in terms of numbers, right? So you ask, and fair enough, how many people died, right? Now, those who were living before the war, they're people with names. But after the war, it's so easy, and after their death, it's so easy just to start speaking of them as numbers, right? So many died here, so many died there. And when you really encounter the historical resources and you're not reading a general history, what happens is that you begin to see people, and they have lives, and they have stories, and they have families. And in our case, we're reading about people who have faith, who want to be disciples of Jesus, for example. And then you read about their deaths, or you hear about their deaths. So it's no longer just a statistic or a number, but you're dealing with the lives of real people. And not only people who were Jews, which we as Christians, have a great affinity for the Jewish people and a great connection with the Jewish people, but you might say there's a double affinity in that these are Jewish believers in Jesus. Right? They share our faith as well as sharing a common heritage, which we do with the Jewish people.
When you've collected all of this research, what are you going to do with it?
When all of this research is collected, it will never be all collected. This is only the beginning of a process, and I believe that we will reveal the tip of an iceberg. And it will be left to others in other generations and in other countries to continue the task of digging further, deeper, in order to bring more of this story to light. Calvin is laying a foundation on which others can build. One of the practical things we want to do, of course, is to make as much of this as possible available on the internet, to have a central archive or database here in Jerusalem. But we also want to build a memorial to those who died here at Christ Church. And the reason we chose Christ Church is because many of the congregations that were wiped out or destroyed in the Holocaust actually had a connection with us. And we sometimes provided pastors or financial support for these Jewish Christian congregations or organizations throughout Europe, both East and West.
Now, Calvin has actually written quite a number of books, and you want to read something from his book. Just tell us a bit about that book.
Yeah, so Calvin has written 2 books so far in connection with this project. The first book he published was Basili and Anna Yoch, and this was a story of a Messianic Jewish family that lived in the Polish city of Lvov. But there's also other stories, other testimonies from Jewish believers in this book as well. And this is a good... You might say this is a good introduction to the subject. So for those who want to know more, I would highly recommend that they start with Crombie's book on the Yoch family. That's Jocz. From that book, by the way, comes a moving story, and I'd like to just say a few words and maybe summarize the story, because again, it just will shock people because we have no recollection, or probably have never been told what Jewish Christians had to go through during the war. And so we have a family, they're Baptist, Jewish people. In his book on Poland, Crombie brings to light many really untold stories or unknown stories of Jewish Christians. And for example, he gives a story of a Jewish Christian family from Belarus. They were executed in May of 1942. There was a Baptist pastor who recorded this for a mission organization. But again, the story never came to light. But this particular family, they were, father and mother, were forced to be slave laborers for the German army, and they were put to work in a German army canteen. And the Germans noticed that they did their work without resentment and very, very pleasantly. And so the commanding general took a shine to them and wanted to help them and protect them. But ultimately, the Gestapo forced the German army to turn this Jewish couple over with their children, and they were taken to execution. But before they were murdered, the Baptist pastor said he was asked to come to their home, and he was asked to officiate at the Lord's Supper. And he said this was the most solemn event, that he ever participated in. And he went on to say that this couple told him, together with their 12-year-old, it says, "When they shoot at us, we will not cry. As soon as we hear the shooting, we know that we will be with Jesus." And the pastor said that he simply broke down and cried, and this couple were killed shortly afterwards. They went to their graves, confident in the resurrection, but they were murdered because they were Jews. And this is just one of hundreds, probably even thousands of stories that Jewish believers in Jesus in Europe had in common.
For anybody who's perhaps listening and has information that would be relevant for this, how can they contact you?
Well, we are indeed looking for stories. We are looking for diaries, letters, anything that might be able to help us. We would be very grateful. They could contact us here at Christ Church Jerusalem, and we can put you in contact with, again, the man really who is doing the hard work, Kelvin Crombie, and he would love to get his hands on any kind of information that has yet to be published, or maybe there are stories that are obscure. So any way that we can be helped in this project, we'll be very, very grateful.
Now, you actually take tour groups to Poland. Tell us a bit about what you're doing taking tour groups to Poland, and when's your next visit?
Well, every year we go to Poland, and we have a study tour. This year it's 12 days, and it starts in July. Actually starts on July the 13th. And the name of the tour is called Narrow Bridge. And this is a phrase that comes from an old Hasidic folk song, which went something like this: "All the world is a narrow bridge, and the main thing is not to be afraid." A narrow bridge, right? Life is like a risky passage over a bridge that may be not very safe or quite narrow. And this summarizes, you might say, Jewish life in Poland for the last 1,000 years. And what we do on the tour is ask the question, how is it that Jews survived and even flourished? And is there anything, I believe there is, that Christian communities can learn today from those Jewish ways of survival, right? What did Jews do to strengthen and flourish, even in the midst of hostility and misunderstanding? And we study Jewish-Christian relations. It's not always bad, and it's certainly not always good. We look at the Holocaust in great depth. And in detail, we look at the history of Poland and how Poland contributed to the Jewish people and the Jewish people contributed to Poland, anti-Semitism, the occult influence on Nazism, and especially, you might say, the role of bystanders in the Holocaust. We focus sometimes on the victims, the Jewish people. We often are fascinated, perhaps in a perverse way, with the killers, the perpetrators. We want to know why they did such things. And then, of course, we say to ourselves in a manner of somehow self-justification, I would never do anything like that. And we examine especially the bystanders. Why is it that so many people in Europe, Poland included, just stood by and did nothing? They didn't participate in the killing, they didn't help in any way, but they refused to lift a finger. And how is that relevant for us today and the evil that is growing in our midst? So that's what we do in Poland is 12 days. We have a lot of fun, and Poland is a beautiful country, and it's not always heavy, but it is a mixture of good fellowship and at the same time some very stimulating or challenging history.
Anyone who'd like to go on this trip or know more information, how can they contact you?
Just through the Christchurch Jerusalem website. They go to our website, they'll see an email address, and we can send them information. Or even better, there is a website for signing up called narrowbridge.com.
Okay, David, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.